Welcome to this lecture in General Linguistics, Second Language Acquisition, Chapter 14, from George Jules, The Study of Language. Having acquainted with the requirements and stages of the first language acquisition, it's time to turn to the second language acquisition. In this lecture, we will discuss the issue of acquiring or learning a second language, i.e., the difference between these two terms. We will talk about the barriers and the factors that affect second language acquisition. Then, we'll discuss the process of learning a second language, focusing on the methods of teaching and learners. Finally, we will talk about the communicative competence in learning a language, and then we'll sum up the whole lecture. Now, let's start with second language learning. Learning is in a foreign language setting, EFL, learning, foreign language, is learning a language that is not generally spoken in the surrounding community. Learning in second language setting, ESL, learning second language, is learning a language that is spoken in the surrounding community. So, obviously the difference is whether the language is used in the surrounding community or not. If the language is spoken in the surrounding community, then it is called a second language. While if it is not used or it is not spoken in the surrounding community, then it is called foreign language. So if we take the examples, EFL in studied by Japanese student who is learning English in Japan, while ESL, Japanese students learning English in the USA. Both situations can be referred to as second language learning. However, when we talk about foreign language, the matter is different. Now, acquisition or learning. Acquisition is defined as the gradual development of ability in a language by using it naturally in communicative situations with others who know the language. While learning is a more conscious process of accumulating knowledge of the features of a language, such as vocabulary and grammar, in an institutional setting. Now, if you take the examples, students can learn mathematics in schools, while children acquiring a second language through the periods spent in interaction constantly using a language with native speakers of a language. So, if we break this down, learning depends on intelligence, human intelligence. It is a process which happens after the critical period which we have studied in the first language acquisition. While acquisition is naturally or innately done in children. Children can acquire their own language or languages through innateness theory, while adults can only learn a second language or a foreign language through the accumulation of knowledge, which is only done through intelligence. Now, acquisition is not without barriers. There are several barriers when acquiring or learning a second language. Three of them are going to be mentioned here. Number one, the second language, or LT as a shortcut, is usually encountered during teenage or adult years in a few hours each week of school. So when learning a language or acquiring a language, time limitation of exposing to the target language or the second language, L2, will be very limited and short. And this is a serious problem for those who try to learn a second language. Number two, very few adults seem to reach a native-like proficiency level in using the second language. Now, if we take the experiment of Joseph Conrad, who's a Polish writer, an excellent Polish writer, when using English, he can write the most significant and most magnificent sentences in English, but when speaking, he cannot speak that well, or there is no comparison between what he writes and how he speaks. He's regarded as one of the greatest novelists in English, but his speaking skills are very poor. 3. After the critical period has passed, around the time of puberty, it becomes very difficult to acquire a language fully. And as we have studied in the first language acquisition, the critical period, or near the age of puberty, the human beings cannot acquire language anymore through innateness theory. They only can accumulate knowledge regarding language. So they would acquire or learn their language through their intelligence. And this is one of the barriers of acquiring a second language. Now there are some affective factors. Acquiring or learning a second language can be affected by several factors that could lead to positive and or negative learning, depending on the following factors. Learning a language is going to be either positive or negative. Number one, many second language learners have feelings of unwillingness or embarrassment in attempting to produce the different sounds of a language. They found it very difficult for them, or very embarrassing for them to produce sounds of the second language that are not found in their own. This may override their physical and cognitive abilities i.e. inhibit the learning process. 2. This type of emotional reaction or affect may also be caused by dull textbooks, and a pleasant classroom surrounding, or an exhausting schedule of study and or work. Sometimes textbooks, classrooms, and schedules are very negatively affecting the process of learning. 3. These negative feelings or experiences are affective factors that can create a barrier to acquisition. i.e., if you are stressed, uncomfortable, self-conscious, or unmotivated, then we're unlikely to learn anything, regardless of whether learning a language or not. the factors of stressfulness, comfortableness, self-consciousness, and motivation are very important and significant factors. Moving them positively, learning is going to be a positive process in favor of the learners. Moving them negatively, the process of learning is going to be negative. Now, there are different methods used in learning or teaching a language, I should say, which aim at fostering the second language learning, among which are the grammar translation method, the audio-lingual method, and communicative approaches. Now, talking about focusing on the method and starting with the grammar translation method, it is a traditional approach that used vocabulary lists and grammar rules to define the target language. So it can be characterized by several characteristics. One, memorization. In this type of methods, memorization is encouraged. Written language rather than spoken language is emphasized. There is no emphasis on the spoken language. And three, it was mainly used to teach dead languages such as Latin. And finally, students do well in exams but face difficulty when using language in everyday conversation because they do not focus on the spoken language. Rather, they focus on the written language. They focus on what should be said rather than what is said. They follow in this method what is called prescriptive grammar or prescriptivism. Another method of teaching language is called AUDIO-LINGUAL method. The AUDIO-LINGUAL method is another approach which emphasizes the spoken language that is repeated several times. Its characteristics are as follows. Number one, this approach emphasizes the spoken language. It is better than the previous method in terms of the means or the version of language, whether spoken or written, that should be emphasized. So it emphasizes the spoken language. Two, the main technique used is to have students repeat in order to memorize structures. Again, the problem of memorization is not sorted out here. So the main technique used is to have students repeat in order to memorize structures. And three, belief, which is a fluent use of a language, is essentially a set of habits. According to the AUDIO-LINGUAL method, their core belief is that using fluent language is a matter of habit or habits that could be developed with a lot of practice, repeating oral drills, repeating, habitualizing these things in mind will make fluent language based on the theory of behaviorism in teaching or learning a language, taking language as an act of behavior. The third method is called communicative approaches. These methods by nature came against the belief that consciously learning the grammar rules of a language will necessarily result in an ability to use the language. Instead, the functions of a language should be emphasized rather than the forms of the language, whether correct or incorrect rules. Now, if we take a class to focus on the function of asking in different social settings rather than the forms of past tense and present tense, students will be able to use language for the function they want. Yes, tenses, grammatical rules are important in demonstrating or clarifying the meaning. However, the meaning, the rules are not enough to use language for particular functions. So, according to the communicative approaches, the focus is on the function that language plays. Without function, there is no communication, and without communication, there is no use of using any language.